Hello and welcome back to the Philosophy of Love and Friendship. We have a lot of ground to cover today because now that we've talked about the Greeks, now that we've talked about Christianity, it's time for us to advance our discussion of history and our discussion of philosophy and our discussion of religion all at the same time, and it's honestly kind of overwhelming, and I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to get it done in a reasonable amount of time, but who cares? We're going to press forward and see what happens. Enough introduction, let's just get into it. So when we left off, the Greeks were basically having a great old time, besides that whole Peloponnesian War business, which, was not a lot of fun, especially when the tyrants took over Athens. Aristotle was currently in charge of the Philosophical Academy and basically running it reasonably well, I suppose. And during Aristotle's tenure as the head of the Academy, this punk shows up, Alexander the Great, and proceeds to take over all of Greece. I mean, technically his father takes over all of Greece. And then Alexander gets the big idea that this is not enough, so he decides to take over the rest of the world as well. And I do mean, the rest of the ancient world. Alexander's empire was by far the largest to date in the Western world. And it is kind of single-handedly responsible for making the West as we understand it. I know people throw that term around a lot, ooh, the West, or Western culture. And yeah, in this class we are focused predominantly on Western culture, as narrow-minded as that might be. But I want to stress that when I use the term Western culture here, I am not referring to, code for America or Western Europe. I'm going to talk about Western culture as being founded essentially by Alexander the Great in Greek culture, and basically everything that spins out of that counts. So when I say Western culture, this is the empire I'm referring to. It's going to get expanded by the Romans in probably half an hour to 45 minutes, but for now, we're going to start here, because the trick with Alexander the Great's conquest of the known world at this point is he performed the fairly miraculous feat of not just conquering it, plenty of people had conquered large swaths of territory up to this point. The Babylonian Empire was pretty impressive. The Medo-Persian Empire proceeded after that and was roughly the same size as we're dealing with here, though they admittedly did not conquer Egypt or Greece. But it's Alexander who not only conquers all this territory, but basically converts them all in the process. It is said that Alexander brought Aristotle along on some of these travels. It is said that Alexander basically slept with a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow. And as, much as that might both be apocryphal, at the end of the day, the key to remember here is that Alexander brings Greek culture with him and insists on everyone in his empire speaking Greek, believing in Greek religion, the Greek myths, studying the Greek philosophers and the great Greek writers, learning Homer, learning Plato. All of this gets passed around as well until Greek becomes the lingua franca of the entire, ancient world, and everyone is speaking Greek, everyone is studying Greek. This is why we're studying Plato and not, say, some of the ancient Hindu Vedas or something. Because Plato gets passed around to a huge swath of land on Earth through the work of Alexander the Great, this process that we usually refer to as Hellenism, which may be misleading. Hellenes are what the Greeks called themselves, so this is the Greekification of the world, effectively. So when we refer to, the Greeks as the foundation of Western culture, this is why. It's not because they're necessarily better than everybody else. People have made those arguments over the course of history, and most of them were bad and dumb. But at the end of the day, I'm going to be arguing that Greek culture spread because of basically the accident of Alexander the Great conquering the world before anyone else did. He brought Greek culture with them, and consequently everyone started to speak Greek, everyone believed in the Greeks, everyone studied the Greeks, and continued to do so for 2,500 years. I want to stress this because, again, like, A, it explains what Western culture is and why it looks the way that it does, as well as I want to stress that, like, we're going to be coming back to the other parts of the West as well. Like, again, we're going to be studying considerably more than just Western Europe over the course of our class, though admittedly we're not going to get too much into, Indian philosophy or Chinese philosophy. Unfortunately, we do not have the time for that. So, again, the big thing to remember here is that right as Aristotle is kind of wrapping up his tenure at the Academy, Alexander takes over the world, and now Greek is the foundational culture for basically the entire ancient world. Now, with that in mind, I do want to swing back around to the philosophy world. Like, this is a mosaic that was representing the Academy. I believe it dates back to the later Roman period, if I'm not mistaken. At any rate, what I want to kind of talk about is what happened to the Academy after Aristotle's tenure. Like, so, hooray, the Greeks are now in charge of the entire world, philosophy, language, culture is spreading, this is all fine and well, but for our purposes, it's just as important to talk about how philosophy is developing as the world is changing. So the thing about Aristotle's Academy, like, after basically Plato founded the Academy, largely in the name of Socrates, he passed it on to Aristotle after his death, and Aristotle died, and there was a bit of a power struggle. After Plato and Aristotle had basically set the course of Greek philosophy for the next forever, the Greek philosophical schools began to fragment and separate, and out of the Academy we got not one, not two, not three successors, but four. Four different philosophical schools, all with their own different priorities, all with their own different way of looking at the world, all of which are derived from Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. You can see echoes of their thought throughout. But these schools were very much independent and kind of like frustrated and bumping into each other and fighting with each other, and there were rivalries and problems, and one of them is going to become extremely important both for history and for our class. But we need to talk about them in the context of everything else that's going on here as well. So first off, there's the Cynics. And to be perfectly honest, the Cynics were not a terribly successful school, since one of their primary, like, philosophical assumptions was, we should all practice poverty, and we should, separate ourselves from society at large. Remember that this is kind of a feature of Platonic philosophy. Remember that Socrates emphasizes, like, his weirdness and, how he just wanders off onto people's porches, and he doesn't seem to have a whole lot of stock in what everybody else is doing, and he generally thinks that everyone else is an idiot. This is kind of the part of Platonic philosophy that the Cynics are most excited about. They, too, have a very low opinion of Athenian society, and their sort of leader, Diogenes the Cynic, who is pictured first here in his giant barrel/pot, and here with his light looking for an honest man in Athens. Spoiler alert, he doesn't find anyone. Diogenes is kind of like the foremost Cynic and sort of the model Cynic, and honestly, his life is not one that most people want to emulate. It is said that Diogenes used to masturbate in public and walk around naked, and he owned nothing but a bowl and a coat, and at one point he went to the river, dipped his hands in the water, and found that he could drink from them and threw the bowl away. He is supposedly the guy who walked in, had a philosophical debate with Plato, took a crap on his floor, and then left. He is quite the guy at the end of the day, but again, if the Cynic philosophy is basically an antagonism with other philosophical schools, a complete repudiation of basic society, and a sort of living completely independent of social mores, again, it doesn't become very popular. There's not a lot of money in living in a barrel and walking around with a lantern and defecating on people's floors. So as much as the Cynics are fascinating, and I'd love to talk about them more, they're not terribly historically important, and they don't do a lot of writing. The Skeptics, on the other hand, are a big deal. The Skeptics are the school that basically gets to inherit the building when Aristotle dies. These are the philosophers who manage to maintain control of the Academy. They're very popular in Athens and kind of throughout Greece. It's complicated and messy. The trick with the Skeptics is they are what they say on their face. Like, they are skeptics. They are skeptical. Their whole claim to fame is, remember how Socrates' whole method is, like, asking questions until people get annoyed and, like, leave him alone. That's kind of their approach as well. The skeptics basically assume that there is no logical truth, that even Plato's theory of the forms or Aristotle's reasonings about, like, logic and formal causes, all that is nonsense, and at the end of the day, you can't prove anything with anything, so they just go around asking questions and destroying other people's philosophies and not having a whole lot to say for themselves. Their method is rigorous and honestly pretty impressive when you read them, but they are extremely fiddly, extremely careful in their reasoning, and that too makes them kind of unpopular. Again, very successful in Greece, they maintain control of the academy, and they hold a very high academic standard. Like, they even call themselves the academicians in addition to the skeptics, because they're the guys at the academy. You'll also occasionally hear them referred to as the peripatetics, like the people who walk around, because they were kind of famous for, like, walking around in like the courtyard of the academy, or walking around Athens having their big elaborate dialogues, following Aristotle and his method as well. At any rate, they are important, they are significant, but they're mostly significant in the way that they are contrasted with the other theories that we're going to be looking at. They are good thinkers, but good thinkers are not necessarily valuable in ancient society. It's all well and good for you to theorize wildly about the nature of reality or logic and ultimately prove that all of our reasoning is ultimately flawed, but if you don't have something to show for it at the end of the day, people are not going to be terribly impressed with what you have to say. Plato is popular because he gave people advice. Aristotle is popular because he helped us understand the world a little bit better. The skeptics are not popular because they offer neither of these things and are just basically annoying to deal with. So moving on. The Epicureans are kind of an interesting grab bag here. Like, you'll remember that both Plato and Aristotle, in both of the texts that we read, they both emphasized that happiness was the goal of human life. The Epicureans take that to heart. The sort of basic philosophical assumption of the Epicureans is that since life is about happiness, then we should go seek out happiness wherever we can find it and enjoy as much happiness as we possibly can. In much of Roman society, especially, the Epicureans kind of get a bad name, like they are accused of being hedonists, by which I mean that they, like, basically are only interested in pleasure, and they are just, sitting around, like, having sex and getting drunk all the time. This is kind of unfair. The Epicureans spend a lot of time sort of refuting this. Like, the Epicureans are interested in happiness in the broader sense, the way that Plato talked about happiness, where happiness involves studying philosophy and becoming virtuous and, becoming learned and erudite. But it doesn't change the fact that quite a few of the Epicureans do really like to have a good time and enjoy orgies just like anyone might. So consequently, the Epicureans are sort of indulgent, or at least understood or portrayed as indulgent, even if that's not the way they actually are. And mostly the Epicureans are significant for our study because of the way that they contrast with the school that really we need to talk about the most, the Stoics. So the Stoics also believe in Aristotle and Plato's whole idea of, like, philosophy is about making people happy and the goal of life is happiness, but they are much more interested in everything that Aristotle and Plato have to say about self-control. You'll remember that in the Symposium, Socrates is depicted as happy, like profoundly happy, but happy because he is in touch with beauty and because he doesn't need anything from the world around him. Remember, he is impassive as a stone. Like, he does not respond to Alcibiades' advances. He doesn't, get drunk at the party. Despite all of the drinking he does, the dude can apparently stand out in the cold and the freezing rain and not have food and be perfectly content. This is what the Stoics kind of model themselves on. They're like, okay, so Plato and Socrates and Aristotle were all men who found freedom, wisdom, and happiness by controlling themselves and being indifferent to their circumstances. We should take that as our starting point. And that's what makes them such an interesting contrast with especially the Epicureans and the academics, the skeptics. Because the Stoics have a completely different approach to how they are going to do philosophy. They are at odds with the Epicureans, who are more about a sort of indulgent approach towards happiness, and they are at odds with the academics because they're much more interested in virtue and living a good life than they are in fiddly philosophy. So with that in mind, the Stoics have a really important philosophy that is going to spread a great deal and become popular for literally thousands of years, like it is still popular today. But it is especially important to us because it has some really important ramifications for the understanding of love and friendship in the years to come. So, Stoic philosophy in a nutshell is about self-control first and foremost. Like, again, in order to get to happiness, you have to be able to control yourself. You have to be rational. You have to be free. And again, this comes from, like, a wider Greek worldview where, like, being rational and being free and being wise are all bound up with kind of living the good life and living the beautiful life. There's a lot of fancy Greek language here, like this is about the kalos and, you know, like living honorably and beautifully. What I want to stress for our purposes is that the Stoics believe that anything that interferes with their freedom, anything that causes them to behave irrationally, is dangerous and is what they need to control themselves from, essentially. So if you've read Lucretius, if you've read Cicero, you'll find this all over the place. You'll find Cicero musing on the subject of whether or not a friend should mourn when a friend dies. Like, on the one hand, friendship is good and valuable, Cicero admits. On the other hand, we should not be so committed to our friends that they cause us to lose our senses or become distraught or become less free as a consequence of them dying. We should bear their suffering with, you know, grace and poise in some respect. Likewise, you'll find Lucretius saying crazy things like, we should avoid strong passion. Love is dangerous. It wounds us and causes us harm. So again, you'll find that the Stoics are, in general, very suspicious of any strong emotion of any kind because it interferes with your freedom, because it interferes with your rationality, because it causes you to be controlled by others and are therefore less beautiful and less good. And the Stoics kind of extend this to include self-sacrifice. Many of the Stoics will emphasize that one's life is to be lived for a greater cause. And usually, especially among the Roman Stoics, that's going to be either the state, Rome itself, like I am going to be willing to give my life for the city, for the people, for the citizens, for Rome, or it has to do with the Stoic afterlife. Which the Stoic afterlife is kind of its own big, complicated study, and I'm honestly not even that qualified to talk about it. What I will say is that here in the, like, late Greek, early Roman period, here in, like, the 2nd century BCE or so, because it's getting messy and we're going to start covering some fairly long swaths of time here, the Stoics are dominant for the better part of 500 years, after all. The understanding of religion and the understanding of the afterlife is shifting. Part of that is because of Plato's own views on the afterlife. Like, you'll notice that Plato frequently sort of degrades the writings of great Greek myth writers like Homer and Hesiod in favor of sort of promoting this new kind of philosophical understanding of the gods, the afterlife, the supernatural world. This is paralleled in the development of Greek religion. Like, for the longest time, yeah, if you were familiar with Zeus or Hera or any of the important, like, gods from the Greek pantheon, yes, that's who they worshipped. But increasingly in later Greek history, like as early as the 4th or 5th centuries BCE, you'll find that there are more interests in these mystery religions, which are kind of offshoots of the Greek myths, but are also sort of only tangentially related. Like, the really popular one that everyone talks about and kind of isn't even that mysterious anymore is the mysteries of the Eleusinian Temple, which is just outside of Athens, which makes it very easy to belong to. Apparently the temple at Eleusis had this whole thing about, like, Demeter, and if you, like, worship corn properly and perform all of perform all of the sacred rites at the temple, then you would, like, endear yourself to Persephone, the queen of the dead, and therefore she would guarantee you, like, a better afterlife or something. This is increasingly the way that religion is looking for the Greeks, for the Romans, for basically the whole West. Whether it's inherited from other traditions like the Jewish tradition or the Babylonian tradition, whether it's, you know, in fact a natural offshoot of, like, the joining of philosophy or mythology, that's all speculation that I'm not terribly interested in doing here. What I need to stress, though, is that the Stoics have a very strong notion of the afterlife. They believe that there is a good and bad place that you go when you die, and therefore by practicing philosophy, by following the dictates of religion, by being willing to sacrifice yourself, remember, like Alcestis does in the speech of Phaedrus in the Symposium, if you're willing to do all that, you will have a better afterlife. And as much as you are sacrificing yourself here in the world, well, the world doesn't matter very much now, does it? Plato talked about this extensively. It is the realm of the forms that we should be interested, the afterlife, the metaphysical realm. And consequently, I will happily give my life here in reality in favor of the reality beyond that, the more real reality, the afterlife and the world that involves, the intellectual life over the mundane physical one. And as much as I should stress, these are like the 4 basic tenets of Stoic philosophy, the ideas we're going to come back to again and again. I should also stress that sort of the characteristics tend to be very, like, martial. This is basically a philosophy designed by soldiers for soldiers. Like, it justifies the being willing to sacrifice your life in a greater, like, cause for the sake of your brothers and fellow soldiers, as well as for the sake of your country, your nation, your culture, whatever. And you'll often find that, like, especially nowadays, we tend to understand this as a typically masculine philosophy. This is how men think. Like, I am going to devote my life to a greater cause and damn my family and my personal interests. Like, I will go out in a blaze of glory, and that is going to be my legacy for years to come, and they will sing songs about me in the generations. Fine. Like, this is a little bit complicated, and it is going to kind of get wrapped up with masculinity, but I want to stress here at the outset, yes, this is a typically masculine philosophy, and it is often very attractive to men, but as we'll talk about, this has some interesting repercussions for women as well. Like, if you've read the letter to Theano, you've probably already seen women passing around the ideas of Stoicism and insisting on it as virtue as well, and coming to some pretty interesting conclusions as a consequence. But I do want to just stress, these are the basic tenets of Stoic philosophy. We are going to be talking about them quite a bit. Notice, too, the repercussions that they have for love and friendship. That on the one hand, this can be very compatible with an understanding of friendship, so long as the feelings aren't that strong, but it is very much incompatible with the passionate understanding of love, where love is good insofar as it makes us obsessed with other people. This is a, philosophical system that values, say, the Socratic or Diotima's ladder approach to love from the Symposium, but sees the Symposium's discussion of Alcibiades or Aristophanes as being low or bad. Those kind of strong outpourings of emotions are womanly and indecent. They are an indication that you are insufficiently schooled or trained. Better to be stone-like Socrates than passionate and, like obsessive the way that Alcibiades is. But you also notice, again, that focus on, like, hey, this is good for soldiers and this is good for dudes and, sacrificing oneself for the sake of the state, or sake of the state. This brings us pretty naturally to Rome. So Rome has been hanging around in the background of the ancient world for quite a while now, and they're getting a little bit more powerful at roughly the same time as the Greeks are starting to go on the road and take their adventures elsewhere. I should stress that, like, we're going to talk about Rome because Rome is a huge deal. It is, in many ways, the sort of most important, historical moment in the history of the West. It is going to have major repercussions down the line for all of the cultures and countries and philosophies that we're going to talk about. Rome is kind of the big show of the ancient world, in a very real sense. People are going to insist on Rome being the height of civilization for literally 1,000 years and change. The medievals are going to talk about Rome like they're always trying to get back to it. The moderns are going to talk about Rome as though it is like the high watermark of human civilization for years to come. We're going to be more skeptical than that, but at the same time, we cannot overestimate the importance of Rome here, and its shadow is going to be very, very long indeed. So I'm going to assume that you know very little about the Roman world, and we're just going to operate as though, like, I need to teach you everything from scratch. That said, I'm not going to get very deep into the discussion. Roman culture and philosophy really isn't my specialty, as much as, you know, it is a big deal and it is really important. What I want to stress is that what I'm about to teach you is very much the most basic stuff you can learn about ancient Rome and the most basic stuff that you'll need to know going forward in this class. But there's a lot more, and there's a lot more nuance, and if you are, in fact, like a Latin scholar and you're listening to this and you're like, that doesn't sound right at all, well, there's the reason for this. This is Ancient Rome 101, essentially. And I am characterizing this definitely with my own biases in mind. So the first thing we need to know is that when we talk about Rome, the Roman Empire is already a misleading term. Rome existed for a lot longer than there were emperors, and in fact, the, period where there were emperors running the show in the Roman Empire, so to speak, is actually kind of small time-wise, even though it is when the Roman power is at its peak and when Roman, spread and control is absolutely at its most powerful. At the same time as Plato and Aristotle are writing, the Romans are flourishing as a republic, they're engaging in the Punic Wars, there's a whole bunch of cool stuff going on there, and Roman history extends easily as far as Greek history. In fact, it's very likely that early Romans probably descended, at least in part, from Greek settlers and colonists who traveled over to Italy and traveled over to Sicily and had a pretty good empire running even as early as 900, 800 BCE. The archaeological evidence is pretty impressive there. But what I want to sort of start with here is the Republic. Rome as a republic, and the Roman Senate as the fundamental governing body here. Rome considers this to be kind of its high watermark. Even after the emperors have started to take control, usually when people start waxing nostalgic about, the high moment in Roman history, they point to Cicero, they point to the ancient senators of the 3rd and 2nd century BCE, and say, man, it was really awesome when we were a republic, and, everyone was virtuous, and nobody was indulgent or, rich, or everyone really did value Rome and Roman culture above themselves in some really impressive ways. This is probably misleading, but again, this is the story that we're going to be told by the Romans for a long period of time, so it is one that you probably should be familiar with yourself. Again, I don't want to get too deep into Roman politics or Roman self-perception or any of that stuff, but it is relevant to understanding the philosophy, relevant to understanding the history, relevant to understanding where we're going with especially Christian society. It's messy, it's complicated, don't worry too much about it, but for now, just know that, Rome was a great republic and sees itself as being at its greatest when the Senate was, the highest power in Rome, when senators and tribunes roamed the earth and, did all the great things in the name of Rome rather than their own grandeur. This includes some pretty impressive military victories and campaigns. The Punic Wars were kind of Rome's big set of battles at the same time as many of the sort of big Greek conflicts were going on. Rome, being situated on the Italian peninsula, was in a great position to control much of the Mediterranean. But the trouble was that there was another city on a different peninsula across the Mediterranean Sea in northern Africa that also was uniquely positioned and very powerful and strong, and the two of them spent literally hundreds of years sort of duking it out, trying to figure out who was going to be the power of controlling the Mediterranean, who was going to have control of the entire Mediterranean world. And especially during the Second Punic War, it wasn't clear how this was going to shake out. Whether Carthage or Rome would be the true power, the true imperial force that was going to run the Mediterranean world. And in the Second Punic War especially, the Carthaginians had this incredible general by the name of Hannibal who was daring and charismatic and extremely intelligent, whose tactics basically undid the Romans over and over again. They were terrified of this guy, and even more so because he had the sheer tenacity to, like, land his army in Spain, if I'm not mistaken, and then, like, march all the way up over the Alps with his freaking elephant army and just undergoing this ridiculous, like, tortuous journey in order to wage a land war against Rome from a direction they were absolutely not prepared for. And while they did manage to beat the Carthaginians, beat Hannibal, they did so by the skin of their teeth. Like, only some really impressive Roman tactics and, you know, this whole... I don't want to get into it. It's wonderful storytelling if you've ever get the time to talk about it more. For now, though, keep in mind that Rome basically did overcome Carthage and sort of realized, hey, we can be in charge of the world now. There's nobody standing in our way. Like, they basically gut Carthage after the Second Punic War, and while there is a Third Punic War, it is kind of a joke by comparison. By the time that they sack Carthage and Scipio Africanus, like, comes back with all the loot of Carthage in order to prove how awesome Rome is, it's basically a done deal. And over the next couple of 100 years, the Romans are going to expand a great deal. The Roman military is now the single most powerful enterprise in Roman affairs. Sacrificing yourself for the military or joining up with the military is the act of patriotism in Rome. And this basically kicks off a huge effort at expansion. By the first century BCE, the Romans have taken over most of Spain, most of northern Africa, they've taken over Greece, and they've even extended as far as Asia Minor. So the Romans are on the move. The trouble is that the Roman policy towards military expansion kind of is self-enforcing. They end up sort of like stuck. Because the whole thing about the Roman army is that if you join up with the Roman army and you serve your time, the pay is you get land, which is pretty dang cool. You get an estate out in one of the provinces, probably one of the ones that you yourself conquered. Very cool. But that means that in order to keep paying their soldiers, they gotta keep taking over territory, which means they kind of get locked into this situation where they need to keep building the army and keep expanding the army so they can keep taking over territory, so they can pay all the soldiers that they're, you know, using to expand the army. This is going to be as much a problem for Rome as it is sort of the secret of Rome's success. The trouble is, as the army gets more and more powerful, as it becomes more and more influential, as the movements of the army become more and more threatening, really charismatic generals also become major threats to the Roman power structure. So when this particularly powerful, particularly popular, charismatic general by the name of Julius Caesar starts, like, having some major military victories, but also kind of defying what the Romans told him to do, like, at one point he, you know, is invading England, and they're like, you know, this has gone on for a long time, dude. You're kind of, like, really far away from Rome. Maybe pull it back because, you know, you're actually kind of getting really popular and threatening some of the senators. And Caesar's like, you know what, I'm going to expand anyway for the glory of Rome. And he, like, takes over even more territory. And the Romans are like, okay, dude, now you've really crossed the line. You get your butt back here and we're going to, like, seriously punish you. And Caesar's like, you know what? I bet you won't punish me if I come over with all of my troops behind me. Like, there's this rule in Roman society that the army is not allowed to pass the river that borders on the Roman city, the Rubicon. Caesar is like, you know what? Screw that. I'm coming with my soldiers, and we'll see how much you want to punish me when you've got all of these dudes' knives at your throat. And he crosses the Rubicon. The die is cast, he famously says. And essentially he walks into Rome with the army at his back and is basically putting a gun to the head of the senators, saying, all right, what are you going to do now? So the senators are troubled by this. They are very worried about the popularity and power that Caesar wields at this point. And they figure, okay, we got to do something about this dude, and they do. They murder him. They murder the shit out of him. Like, they stab him something like 23 times on the steps of the Senate. They, like, call him in, and then they just kill him. It's not necessarily official. It is, you know, a group of senators who aren't necessarily, like, working with the other senators. But at any rate, dude is still very dead. very, very murdered. And all of his soldiers and all of the people who he has made friends with are suddenly up in arms, and they're all chasing after these senators. And what's more, his family members, who also wield a considerable amount of power, his cousins Octavian and Mark Antony, both of them are very angry and basically take control of the army jointly, and they run all the senators out of town, and suddenly there's a huge power struggle and civil war going on here in the roughly around 50 BCE. Now, Octavian and Mark Antony basically have the ear of the army, so they have no problem kicking the butt of all of those senators who, murdered their family member. The trouble then becomes, okay, so now who's going to be in charge? Is it going to be Octavian who takes on Caesar's mantle as dictator, or is it going to be Mark Antony who takes on Caesar's mantle as dictator? And for a while there, it looks like it's going to be pretty evenly matched. Octavian certainly has more power and influence in Rome itself, but Mark Antony is making friends with one of the most important Roman provinces. In fact, he's making real nice with this empress over in Egypt, Cleopatra. But Octavian actually uses that against him and manages to rally more Roman power and influence on the grounds that Mark Antony has been corrupted by the evil witch Cleopatra, as you may have heard about in that video that I assigned for you. So he takes the entire power of the Roman army and the entire power of Roman influence, marches over to Egypt, and basically, attacks Antony to the point that, Antony is killed. Cleopatra, hearing about it, commits suicide by apparently, having a snake bite her. Yeah, it's wild stuff. Can't make this shit up, guys. At any rate, Antony and Cleopatra are both out of the picture, and now Octavian basically says, alright, I'm changing my name. I am now Augustus, and I am the Emperor, thank you very much. He calls himself Augustus Caesar and basically establishes the line of the emperors from here on out. But naturally, people have some questions about this, because it was one thing for Julius Caesar to be dictator. It's effectively emergency ruler of Rome for however long it takes to get out of the emergency. For Caesar to say, okay, so I'm going to be in charge forever now, this is a permanent position. The senators are not necessarily a huge fan of this, and the people are not necessarily a huge fan of this. So Augustus embarks on this whole basically propaganda campaign to shore up his power and ensure that he is viewed as the rightful ruler of all Rome. All power congregates in his person. And a large part of this is, during Augustus's reign or shortly after Augustus's reign, some of the most powerful writers and some of the most famous thinkers in Roman history and culture end up making a lot of stuff that sort of backs up Caesar Augustus's claims. So our guy Virgil, he writes basically the Roman answer to the Iliad and the Odyssey in the Aeneid, which is essentially this epic poem that talks about Roman origins and the great hero Aeneas, who supposedly founded Rome when he took off from Troy after Troy was sacked by the Greeks, after the events of the Iliad. Virgil writes a lot into the text of the Aeneid, emphasizing that, hey, not only is Aeneas a big deal and he founded Rome, but actually Aeneas is directly related to Julius Caesar. Who knew? And therefore, since Julius Caesar, logically passed on control of the empire to Augustus Caesar, it only makes sense, right? Augustus is the direct line of Aeneas himself. He is, the blood of kings and rulers and the last scion of Troy, so naturally he is, the rightful ruler of all Rome. Likewise, where, Livy, the great historian of Rome, also emphasizes the significance of Julius Caesar and sees this as a natural outpouring of, Roman power and authority, Livy also makes the pretty bold claim that, Rome has gotten away from its original principles. Rome has fallen and, become morally degraded. Remember the greats, remember Cicero, remember, Tullius and the Gracchi, remember these men who were willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of Rome, and now all we've got are these, indulgent, aristocratic senators who are all, just having sex and, drinking, and they don't even have proper family values. They're getting divorces, and their wives are leaving, and they're having adulterous affairs. What is up with that? What we need is a real strong leader with real military values who is going to, steer Rome in the right direction again. And this is kind of the whole theme of Augustus's reign and Augustus's propaganda efforts here. Remember, Mark Antony was, like, in bed with that Egyptian woman. Like, what the heck was wrong with him? He wasn't a true Roman. True Romans fight for Rome. True Romans stand independent. True Romans are not influenced by women. It's time to make Rome great again. And this, too, is also influencing the people who aren't popular in Roman society. Like, again, Ovid is a hugely famous Roman poet. He gets a whole lot of press because, like Livy, he also, draws a direct connection between Aeneas and Julius Caesar. Like Virgil, he recharacterizes the myths to favor Roman rule and, to present Rome as the greatest empire ever and stress that, like, the Roman Empire will exist forever and be awesome. And, by the way, Julius Caesar is still totally the legitimate heir, and therefore Augustus is like the best thing to happen to Rome ever. But Ovid also kind of doesn't know when to shut up. Ovid has this whole poem called The Art of Love, where he, like, puckishly talks about how, love is silly and ridiculous and a lot of fun, and, adultery is fun, and actually, like, having sex with other women is totally fun, and, really it's just silly, and why get upset about it, and it's just a good time, like, let people have their fun. Which is really badly timed, because at the moment Augustus's daughter is kind of sleeping with this guy who she totally shouldn't be sleeping with, and is becoming a bit of a citywide scandal. So when Augustus hears that Ovid is, writing all this stuff about, like, hey, love is silly and fun, and, who cares about rules, and let's just have a good time, he very much exiles him. Like, you are no longer welcome in Rome, thank you very much. And if I'm not mistaken, Ovid even, like, dies shortly after his return from exile. So that's a bummer. But all of this contributes to this idea that Augustus is very pro-Stoicism. And increasingly, this is going to be the philosophy of Rome. Like it kind of was for a long time. Again, Cicero is one of the people that everybody points to as being this great Roman statesman, the ideal Roman soldier. And he was very much a Stoic, or at least informed a great deal by Stoic ideas. But now Stoicism has gone from being like the sort of characteristic philosophy of the Romans to essentially a mandate. Stoicism is manly. Stoicism, like, embraces the military and recognizes that one is supposed to subordinate oneself to one's responsibilities to Rome, the city. And consequently, you should be a Stoic. Because if you want to be a good Roman, you're going to have to be a good Stoic as well. You don't want to be one of those, overly philosophical Greek skeptics with their silly ideas that don't go anywhere. Cicero points fun at them, and, Augustus and company, they're all about this as well. Because as much as the Romans have taken over the world and have even taken over Greece, what they haven't managed to do is the same thing that Alexander did. They can't get everybody to speak Latin and to, adopt the Roman names for things and practice Roman religion instead of Greek religion. No, the Greeks are still just speaking Greek and talking about Greece and, doing Greek philosophy and following the Greek gods, and the Romans are really annoyed by this, and there's a bit of an inferiority complex going on here, so, yeah, we're not having it. Like, no, you don't want to be like the Greeks. You want to be Stoic, like a Roman, and not an academic. Good grief, weirdos. Nor do you want to be an Epicurean, because they're indulgent, and they're weak, and they're feminine, and they're, like, morally depraved or something. So, Stoicism becomes the de facto philosophical system of the Roman Empire. Either be Stoic or get out is kind of what the Romans are emphasizing. Augustus builds his career on this sort of Stoic platform. Stoicism is going to be the dominant philosophy going forward, largely because it is Augustus's philosophy, largely because it is the philosophy of now the ruling class, largely because it's these other philosophies, the Epicureanism like Mark Antony, or the skeptics like the failed Greeks, who are now seen as weak or lesser or pathetic in some way. But this is what brings us to, the Rome at the height of its power, but this comes with some pretty big questions. Like, Rome in the 2nd century AD is at the greatest height of its power. It is going to reign over more territory than it has at any time before or since. This is Rome at its height, and it's largely because of Augustus's doing, the Pax Romanum that is guaranteed to last for 100 years and is totally not a lie because there's totally not other, like, internecine fighting happening all over the place. But this is largely considered to be Rome at its peak. As much as, again, this is all on the grounds that, like, we need to get back to the old republic, get back to when Rome was great, get back to when we were fighting the Punic Wars and when we had real enemies to conquer. This is all kind of a misdirect in some ways, because at the end of the day, this is Rome at its most powerful, even though it is also in many ways Rome at its most fragile. So that's why when we talk about Stoicism and we talk about sort of its philosophical, like, influence and how significant it was in history, we end up with, shocker, 2 stories. Yes, again, remember this is a history class, and that means we're talking to historiography in this class as frequently as possible, just as we had 2 stories of Socrates, and we're going to look at the 2 different contrasting perspectives there. Now I want to talk about the 2 contrasting perspectives on what is Rome's legacy. Because at the end of the day, the relationship between Rome, between Stoicism, and the sort of, like, philosophical underpinnings here, this is controversial and complicated. Lots of scholars are debating about it today. Lots of historians and great thinkers are debating about it today. And historically, people use Rome as the model for the perfect society, or at least the closest we've come to a perfect society. The founders of the Constitution in America insisted on using the Roman Republic as the foundation for the new constitution that they were writing. Like, other cultures and societies, which we'll talk about in a moment, have also used Rome as the sort of foundational model for how to do a government. This is largely because the Romans have a great PR department, and they very much insist on how awesome they are, and, lots of these people tend to agree with that. But the message of why were they great, why were they successful, what is it about their culture that helped them, and what is it about their culture that hindered them, that's the real question here. Like, when you are presented with, okay, the Romans were the greatest empire of the ancient world, and basically everyone assumes that this is true, though honestly this is probably also a fairly complicated question, you are then given the sort of follow-up, okay, so why were they great? Did Stoicism ultimately make Rome who they were? Was Stoicism their strength or their weakness, or was it both? How do we understand this? And you will find a lot of people emphasizing that Stoicism is the sort of secret sauce of Rome's success. That it is because they were Stoics that they were so successful for as long as they were, that they conquered as much territory and were as great as they were, because of their return to these republican values, because they tried to get back to the world of Cicero and the Punic Wars, because they had this disciplined military, because they had this disciplined family, which, Augustus is especially trying to, insist upon. He's passing new laws that forbid adultery, that encourage marriage, because everyone is willing to sacrifice themselves for the sake of Rome the city, Rome the state, Rome the greater cause, because the government is strong and centralized, because we have these capable emperors who are doing great things for Rome. This is why Rome was successful. This is why Rome reached its peak in the 2nd century. Many historians will argue that this is the case, that Stoicism is the most important part of Roman success. And you will find lots of thinkers, especially once we get to the modern era in the 15th and 16th centuries, who are talking about how Stoicism is, at the end of the day, basically coextensive with virtue. If you want to be a good person, you follow Stoic values. You do all that stuff we talked about. You emphasize self-control, and you focus on, causes greater than yourself, and you don't worry about, dealing with hardship or suffering. You seek happiness through hardship and suffering, essentially. And with this in mind, when Rome does fall, because, spoiler, Rome falls in 300 years, as much as Rome is at its peak in the 1st or 2nd century AD, by the 5th century, it's gone. At least Rome the city is gone, even if Rome the power structure is more complicated. We'll talk about it. When people say Stoicism is the secret sauce of Roman success, they're usually going to insist that Rome fell because they fell away from Stoic values. Because the individual Romans started practicing indulgence, became more Epicurean than Stoic. Because senators and emperors became, more interested in their own power and success than they were in the success and power of Rome itself. Likewise, they'll point to things like internal division. Look at all these Christians and, other sort of, separate factions rising up in Roman culture. Look at the way that the Jews and the Christians are fighting against traditionally Roman values and prioritizing their own religions over the Roman state. This is why Rome fell, because of their disunity, because the people no longer had this singular focus that informed them. Likewise, you'll notice that the people are getting stronger around Rome. There's some moving and shaking going on in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. It is likely that the Huns are displacing the Gothic tribes who used to hang out in Eastern Europe. Suddenly they're getting pushed into Western Europe and they're bumping into Roman borders more and more frequently because they do have that strong single-mindedness. They are the ones who will ultimately overcome Rome. Rome's star is falling because of this moral degradation and internal division at the same time as these enemies are getting stronger. Their star is rising. But on the one hand, this makes a good story, and you will find lots of people telling this version of events. I'm honestly pretty sure Gibbon's famous rise and fall of the Roman Empire, or the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, is basically making this very argument. I want to stress that there are plenty of other thinkers who are seeing kind of the exact opposite conclusion here. Stoicism isn't Rome's secret sauce to success. Stoicism is what destroyed Rome. Stoicism is what made Rome weak in some respect. Largely because the Stoic philosophy that we're seeing maps really neatly onto what is essentially fascism and tyranny. That Rome considered itself greater than its own provinces, was no longer interested in maintaining peace in those provinces, and was just trying to glut itself on the riches that they could take from those provinces. And consequently, as they expanded and became greater and greater, as they insisted on controlling more and more territory, they found that actually their bureaucracy was stretched largely beyond its appropriate extension. Rome was too far away from the furthest provinces, and they insisted on maintaining this absolute rule with this centralized government. This turned out to be as much a liability as a strength. As much as it's great to have only one leader, a dictator or a tyrant or an emperor, to call the shots when you are in the middle of a military campaign, when that emperor has to fight wars on 5, 6, 7 different fronts, it becomes a liability. You no longer need this one strong, unified vision. You need multiple people in multiple places with multiple power centers in order to control this vast amount of territory and this complicated number of problems that you're facing. So all of these things that made Rome strong, the centralized government focused in Rome itself, the taxation of the provinces leading to unrest, the sort of congregation of power and wealth in one place, this was frequently framed as Rome's greatest strength and increasingly became its greatest weakness. The centralized government became a liability. And consequently, when Rome fell, it probably fell because the leaders were no longer trustworthy. They were selfish and cruel, and they were trying to take too much power to themselves. They were trying to be greater than they actually were. They thought they were more virtuous than they actually were. Their growth was too great, and their greed too strong. And consequently, when we talk about Rome, we kind of need to balance our discussion. On the one hand, yes, it was great and probably the greatest empire that ever existed. On the other hand, it doesn't necessarily serve as a model for how to do empire now. And yet many people have taken it that way. Both Mussolini and Hitler looked at Rome as the proper forebear of their various globe-conquering enterprises. Mussolini largely because he was Italian and Roman culture was all around him, but even Hitler, when he talks about the Third Reich, sees Rome as the First Reich and the Second Reich as the Holy Roman Empire. He sees himself as being the logical next step in Roman authority and greatness, building the next empire that is the logical successor to Roman power. So Rome has been the inspiration for democracy and republics and constitutions that we largely consider to be mostly egalitarian and fair. It has also been the inspiration for fascists and tyrants and dictators. Both have been used, or both have been sort of logical extensions of seeing Rome as great. So when I say that there are two stories here, I want to stress that this is actually more than two stories. This is a constellation of stories. Was Rome as great as we think it is, or was it a bunch of tyrants who just ran around making life miserable for everybody else? Like, we see a lot of writing from Roman writers, people writing in Latin, people focused on the city, who are talking about how awesome the city is, or for that matter, how crappy the city is. We don't hear nearly as much from the completely oppressed people in the distant provinces who are stuck paying taxes and not actually being all that happy with Roman rule, who are suffering under the Romans' boot instead of enjoying the wealth that they've stolen from all these other people. But as part of that constellation of stories, these wide variety of historical interpretation that we should engage in, we should also notice that when I say Stoicism here, it's also more complicated than this. Stoicism as this hyper-masculine, congregating power to itself, yeah, that's a huge problem, but it's also not necessarily Stoic. Remember that the Stoics focus on, self-control, sure, but it is self-control for the purposes of freedom and independence. And the truth is, Stoicism actually did some really counterintuitively good things for the Roman people at the time as well. Stoicism is kind of the kicking off point for a widespread liberation and some of the same things that many Romans considered to be morally degraded. So, under the ancient Roman legal system, the 12 tables, there was this system of sort of familial government in place where the paterfamilias, the head of the family, was in charge of the entire family. This is very similar to what we saw in the Greek system, where it's like the guy who's in charge of the estate runs everything, and all the women on the estate, all of the children on the estate, all the servants and all the slaves on the estate, they're all dependent on this one man for their power and authority. The paterfamilias essentially worked the same way. Only, if anything, it was even stronger and even meaner. A son, a daughter, a wife, all of these were essentially considered under the hand, cum manu, the paterfamilias. And he could literally command them to die, and nobody would necessarily even blink at that. If a child was born in his house and they were too poor to sustain it, he would literally have it killed. And that was totally fine. That was considered his right as the head of the family, as the rightful leader, the essential dictator over his own little dynasty. And it's these paterfamiliases who were like the senators, the people who would represent their family and represent their districts in the Roman Republic. And importantly, too, this meant that women were basically property here. That essentially when a woman got married, she stopped being her father's property and essentially became her husband's property. Only not really, because she was still under the hand of her father. It's messy and complicated, and it's not my area of expertise. But my understanding is, now she's sort of directly controlled by her husband, but only because her father is, letting this happen. And it is largely for her own protection, because when her father dies, then she's under the hand of her husband instead. Likewise, as the Greeks, a man could get, divorced, and a man could commit adultery largely without any punishment. Occasionally, especially in the later periods, you'll see husbands being shamed for divorcing their wives on, bad principles. Again, largely because of Stoic philosophy. If a man leaves his wife because he is more attracted to another woman, this is considered a moral failing by the Stoics. Oh, you were too passionately involved with this other person and failed to recognize your duty, your, responsibilities to your family and these causes greater than yourself. Which is why, between the Stoics and the rise of the emperors, we see a shift away from this organization towards the marriage sine manu, which is marriage without the hand. And under this model, there are more freedoms and more power granted to the people under the paterfamilias. Part of this is sort of informal. It just kind of happens and is sort of like gradually legislated as it occurs. But it's noteworthy, too, that for the emperors, this is probably advantageous. It disempowers the senators and makes it less likely that they're going to revolt or uprise against the imperial rule. So, in theory, this is a good idea for the emperors, though in fact this contributes to that same moral degradation that so many people are so upset about. Because under this system, you can no longer, like, control your son. Like, the paterfamilias no longer gets to, like, kill his son whenever he wants to. There's probably still a tradition of, like, letting, unwanted children die by exposure, largely because we've got plenty of documented evidence from Christian families adopting these exposed children, as well as plenty of evidence in the text, or the text that we find that indicate that, like, there are lots of legitimate children who are up for adoption after their parents die for whatever reason, but a suspiciously low number of bastards, which almost certainly were happening, just weren't happening as much because these kids were not accepted and therefore killed in one way or another. Yeah, fun fact, guys, the Romans actually had a long-standing tradition of infanticide in one respect or another. It's messy, ancient civilizations suck, I don't know what to tell you. But under the new sine manu system, under the new perspective on the role of the father and the role of the husband in one's household affairs, now the children can't be killed. It is now illegal to do that. And if, in fact, a father abuses his son, mistreats his son, that son is therefore granted emancipation, which usually was considered a punishment, like you were no longer under anyone's hand, and are therefore, stuck making life your own way. But under the new Roman Empire, this is actually considered a fairly good thing. You want to be independent. You want to basically build your own branch of the family separate from your father's control. And consequently, this becomes normal. Fathers emancipate their sons as a sort of celebration. They give their sons a certain amount of money and they let them found their own empires, let them build their own branches of the family, much like we see nowadays. Which is probably where the Christians and where contemporary society gets it from. This idea of emancipation of, the father and son living in separate households kind of starts here in some respect. And fathers tend to be fairly indulgent of their sons, giving them the leg up to represent their own branch of the family their own way. But at the same time, you'll notice that the situation for women is also dramatically increasing, and largely for the better. Women are gradually given more and more power and influence as far as their economic independence, as well as who they get to marry, starting with laws that are insisted upon by Augustus that marriage requires the consent of both the husband and the wife, which is kind of a big deal. Up until this point, literally most of these marriages were arranged for the advantage of both parties. Again, much like the Greeks. You would send off your son to, hang out in somebody else's house, or marry a woman into your own house by marrying her to your son in order to guarantee strategic political alliances or whatever. Now, if either the son or the daughter, either the, husband-to-be or the bride, say that they don't want this, then the entire proceedings are shut down immediately. Which means there's no point in trying to get young men and women to sort of get forced into an arranged marriage. Now, the paterfamilias has very little power over what his family is going to look like in the future. And women have an actually very important say in who they get married to. A father who wants to marry his daughter off for a strategic alliance can't do that unless she's on board with it. So there's no point in trying to force something that isn't going to happen. Likewise, under the new sine manu system, the guardian of the woman is still necessary for her to go out in public, but this is increasingly done away with. Initially, as soon as a woman has 3 children, it's like, okay, she's got her kids, she's provided for her husband, she's ensured the line of the family. She can do what she wants now. And she's allowed to go out into public unaccompanied. She's allowed to, decide her own inheritance at that point. If the father or if one of her sons isn't around to do it, she can inherit from her own parents or dedicate, her will to somebody else. And eventually, even the basic guardianship of, only for women with 3 or more children eventually fades away as well. And women are just allowed to be economically independent, to make their own lives, to go out into public and do whatever they want, with no supervision whatsoever. And there are plenty of stories in this period in Roman history of wives who are essentially partners to their husbands, or who even exceed their husbands in some way, who are noteworthy for their own virtues and who accomplish great things in Roman history and are respected as a consequence. Likewise, at this point, you'll notice that divorce is granted to everybody. Like, once upon a time, if a man wanted to divorce his wife, he could do so, but everyone would, like, grumble about it. Now, if a wife wants to divorce her husband, she can, just at the drop of a hat. Like, nobody even questions it. It's just like, okay, sure, just sign here on the dotted line. And likewise, adultery is punished for both parties equally. There is no longer this sense that the man is the tyrant of the household. He is very much on an equal footing with his wife. They are economically consenting independents in some respect. And honestly, this is more egalitarian, this is more feminist, I dare say, than at any point we're going to see in the future until probably the 20th century. Like, I know that that's kind of a wild thing to think about, that, like, there were many, many steps forward, and then there were many, many steps back. But, yeah, I hate to break it to you, but it is going to be largely the Christians and sort of the increased sort of, like, dictatorial models practiced during feudalism in the medieval era that puts women in a really disadvantageous position. Not so much because of Roman precedent here. So what I want to stress is this is all kind of also Stoicism. Like, as much as we usually think of Stoicism as being this traditionally masculine philosophy, as having this, you know, self-control, toxic masculinity, like, we don't talk about our feelings and we don't give in to strong emotions kind of attitude, I should note that Stoicism actually did a lot of liberation for women at the time, because, again, Stoicism, properly understood, is all about independence, about being separate from the rest of the world, about cultivating yourself and practicing rationality and virtue without the influence of anyone around you. Since this is something that women and men could do, the Stoics extended this to women and men equally. And some of those same great women that I was talking about include some people like the wife of Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, who also tried to commit suicide when her husband committed suicide as a result of his condemnation by the Roman authorities. Like, Stoicism was a philosophy women could and were encouraged to practice. And just as we see with Theano, you know, women practicing Stoicism could look like masochism or misogyny. It could be, you know, be the bigger woman and let your husband cheat on you and don't condemn him for this. Or, especially once women had more economic independence, because Theano was written considerably before the marriage sine manu laws are current and in place, it can be an indication that you shouldn't be dependent on a man, and don't have to be. The world is now organized in such a way, because of Stoic influence, that that's not necessary anymore. So I want to stress, Stoicism has many faces. In our class, we are going to frequently be suspicious of Stoicism, because it is frequently suspicious of love. But that doesn't mean that just because you are a Stoic means that you must be a toxic masculine tyrant. You can be a Stoic and a liberator, and in fact many Stoics were. Stoicism is big enough and broad enough and good enough to accommodate a lot of these different perspectives. So keep this in mind. There is not just two stories of Stoicism here. There are many more. And I hope that, you know, we get the chance to examine some of them as we go. But for now, I want to turn our attention to the history of the Roman Empire going forward. Now that we've got our glimpse of what was Stoicism's influence on Rome, and, you know, at this particular moment in the early imperial history, like, what is Stoicism and how does it relate to, you know, the philosophers, the thinkers, the people who were hanging around at the time, I want to stress that this is still got kind of a clock on it. As much as, like, the early Roman Empire is populated by a lot of powerful and well-respected emperors like Augustus or Tiberius or Hadrian, we are eventually going to give way to a pretty tumultuous period in Roman history. And it's going to eventually devolve into a period where, like, for 50 years, there's something like 60 different emperors, because they keep getting assassinated and poisoned, and because, like, all of this Game of Thrones-esque drama is taking place, and it's just a giant freaking mess. mess, actually. As much as there are some great Stoics among these emperors, Marcus Aurelius in particular is like famous for his Stoic meditations. At the end of the day, this Roman Empire is going to fall, at least in part because of some really bad leadership on the part of some Roman Empire or emperors. But at the same time as this is happening, we should also remark that this is also where Christianity plugs into our conversation. Like, the initial reaction of the Romans to the Christians was one of complete persecution. When, Nero and the early emperors realized that they could blame the Christians for the problems that were going on, like, Nero is famous for this. Nero was, accused of, like, burning down Rome at one point. In fact, he was not even in the city at the time. Like, there's this famous parable about how he fiddled while Rome burned. Like, he was so indulgent and so aristocratic and so rich that he, like, didn't care about the poorer sections of the city being destroyed. This was not true. He was just not in the city at the time. But everyone was saying that it was true, and he was trying to get rid of this PR nightmare that he was involved in, and he ultimately came up with, well, let's blame the Christians for it. It wasn't Nero who burned down Rome, it was the Christians who burned down Rome. Because the Christians are following the wrong gods, and they're not worshipping the emperor properly. And so Nero started off a long tradition of persecuting Christians, and that includes, as you can see here, crucifying them and then setting them on fire. Like, this is historically accurate. The feeding them to the lions thing is actually probably considerably less accurate, although it's probably the more famous story. At any rate, despite this, Christianity spreads like wildfire here in the later Roman period under the emperors. Like, Jesus himself is supposedly born under the rule of Emperor Augustus, which is kind of a big deal, because Emperor Augustus, when he, like, takes the role of emperor, literally calls himself the Son of God. Like, that's printed on the coins. And then when Jesus shows up and starts saying, no, actually, I am the legit Son of God, yeah, this freaks people out, and, this can be understood as a threat to Roman authority and an attack on the imperial line, which, at this point, the Roman emperors are perceived as gods, or at least that they will be perceived as gods when they die. It's complicated and messy, don't want to get into it too deeply. Again, Christianity is kind of the key that we're focusing on here. But whatever the reason, either because of its popularity or because, like, people are just really impressed when they see all of these dudes getting crucified and being like, I do it gladly for my God. They're like, dang, who are they worshiping? I want to get some of that nonsense. At any rate, again, between the efforts of missionaries and the popularity of the religion and the fact that it is ultimately very humane and whatever, Christianity ends up spreading to all of the major urban centers throughout the Roman Empire. Now, you'll notice that most of them tend to be in the east. Like, over here in Asia Minor, what's called Turkey today, there are obviously, like, many over here in Israel and Jerusalem. Big surprise, seeing as Jesus lived and walked around in Jerusalem, and that's kind of where the whole thing gets kicked off. But also in Rome, in Carthage, and all of the major Greek cities, you'll see that these are some major Christian centers. And increasingly, they will be spreading out into the surrounding countryside over the next couple of hundred years. But the tension here remains unresolved. Like, as much as, Nero persecutes Christians pretty outwardly, other emperors are less enthusiastic and prefer to do it on the quiet, to the point that, like, during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the policy is kind of like, don't ask, don't tell about Christians. Like, if you just don't make a big deal out of it, we're not going to persecute you, but if, all of a sudden we find a Christian church and you're making a lot of noise, well, yeah, we're going to have to do something about it. Additionally, though, because of the Christians, because of these alternative religious perspectives, and because there's more and more influence in the provinces, the major urban areas in the east rather than the west, Rome has kind of a civil war problem on its hands. Not that they have, like, one big civil war, but they're getting protests and, like, uprisings in all of these major cities, including Rome itself, for various reasons, and this is becoming more and more difficult to manage. So in the it's either the 3rd or the 4th century, Diocletian, the emperor at the time, decides, you know what, he's had it. Rome cannot be the center of the empire anymore. Too much of the power is in the east, and it's getting too hard to dispatch orders all the way across the Mediterranean every time something goes wrong. So he decides he's going to straight up split the empire in half. We're going to have the Western Roman Empire with Rome as its center, and the Eastern Roman Empire with a capital to be determined. And Diocletian is going to run over here in the east because, honestly, at this point, the east is more powerful, it's richer, it is the better place to be. Rome is kind of fallen on hard times now that the Germanic tribes are getting real close to threatening them. Now that, all of the major educational centers and all of the major trade centers are over here in the east, Diocletian's going to take this part, and we're going to give the west over to this Maximian guy who's going to largely delegate it to his second-in-command, Constantius. So now, instead of one emperor, we've technically got four. One who's in charge of the whole thing, technically, over here in the east. That would be Diocletian, the Augustus of the Eastern Empire. But there's going to be an Augustus over in the west as well, and there are going to be Caesars, sort of like under-emperors in both places. Hopefully, with this bureaucratic system in mind, this will take the weight off of the one individual leader and allow Rome to function more smoothly. But Constantius, the Caesar over in the west, his son Constantine has other ideas. And yeah, this is ominous as hell, and it's just going to be even more scary as we go on. Constantine decides he's not going to settle for being like second in command over in the Western Empire. No, he wants the whole thing. So he marches on Rome, and at this famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge, things change pretty dramatically for the Roman Empire, because Constantine declares, when he wakes up in the morning of the battle, that apparently he saw a sign in a dream, and he tells all of his soldiers to paint this symbol on their shields, as you can see in the painter's rendition here. And apparently they all fight, and they are successful, and Constantine declares it is because that we put the symbol on our shields that we were successful today. Fun fact, this symbol is the Chi-Rho. It is the two first letters of the Greek word for Christ. And it is therefore widely understood that Constantine is taking orders from the Christian God himself. At least that's what the Christians think. The real trick of it is that Constantine is playing a pretty dangerous game. At the time, the two dominant religions are the Zoroastrian faith, which sees like the unconquered sun Mithras as being like the primary deity, and at the same time the Christians are getting more dominant with their idea of like Jesus and also God as being the primary deities. So Constantine actually makes a lot of hay out of like, I worship the one God, and everyone is free to interpret that however they see fit. But what is clear, and what is not nearly as subtle or, quiet, is the fact that Constantine is going to make Christianity legal now. If you want to practice Christianity, you are welcome to, and there will be no fear of persecution to go along with it. In fact, Constantine is going to consider you a pet project. Whether or not Constantine is actually a Christian is really debated. There are stories about how he was baptized on his deathbed. It's complicated, not going to get into it too deeply. For now, what I want to emphasize is now we've got a Western Roman Empire and an Eastern Roman Empire, because, again, fun fact, Constantine immediately divides it back in half, because, yeah, that was a really good way of doing things. He does found his own capital over here in Constantinople. Dude with a big head names the major city, the capital of the Eastern Empire, i.e. the rich part of Rome, after himself. And he splits it right back into the West and East again. Now, importantly, again, Christianity is especially influential in the East, but it is very influential in the West as well. In fact, more than you might think. Even places where Rome isn't terribly influential, places like Scotland or in Germany, these places are getting Christianized as well, though it's, again, a complicated story. Constantine also organizes Christianity. He insists that they basically get their shit together, because at this point there are a whole bunch of different Christians in a whole bunch of different places, and since they're stuck like underground and not being able to reveal themselves, many of the churches are kind of not in communication with one another, and consequently they all have different ideas of how the church is supposed to be conducted and how the faith and religion is supposed to work. Like, some of them don't even practice the same like traditions, some of them don't even read the same texts. Like the famous heretic Arius, he doesn't see any of the Gospels as legitimate except the Gospel of Luke. So Matthew, Mark, John, all thrown out, which everybody is really grumpy about. So Constantine's like, quit fighting each other, quit killing each other, get your shit together. I'm going to get all of you under one roof, and you're all going to decide what it is that you actually believe. And they do. At the Council of Nicaea, they decide, here is our creed, here are the fundamental principles of our belief. If you don't believe this, you are a heretic, and if you do believe this, you are a Christian, no matter how weird your convictions might be otherwise. And this is going to get complicated. There are going to be more councils, more, meetings of Christians over time. none of which are going to be too terribly important for our purposes. But what I do want to stress is that there is this basic division between the West and East. Because over here in the West, the Christians are doing Roman things. They are practicing Roman traditions. They are reading and speaking Latin. They are following Latin scholars and philosophers like Tertullian and Latin theologians of Christianity like Tertullian. Whereas over here in the East, it is still very Greek influenced. So the church in Jerusalem and Alexandria and Antioch and Constantinople, all of them are speaking Greek and following Greek traditions. People like Origen or Clement of Alexandria or Justin Martyr, yeah, there are a lot more of them, because again, this is the rich populous part of the empire at this point, and there is a kind of friction between these two, especially when Rome falls. Like, yeah, big spoiler here, roughly around the 5th century AD, the Ostrogoths invade Rome and manage to conquer the place. And the two halves of the empire are now truly sundered from one another. The Eastern Roman Empire is the Roman Empire now. And the Western Roman Empire, well, some of the Gothic kings claim to be the emperor, but essentially they're going to be operating under their own steam. And as a consequence, the Christian tradition is sundered as well. Like, when Rome falls, the Roman Christians are unable to talk to all of the other Christians over in the East. Like, yeah, they can send messages back and forth, but it's not as easy to talk as, getting together, a council every time that they want to. And this largely leads to what is known as the Great Schism. By the 11th century, we now have two Christianities, with two sets of traditions, largely operating under two fundamentally different power structures as well. We have the Eastern Church in the East, what will one day be called Eastern Orthodoxy, and the Western Church in the West, what will one day be called Roman Catholicism. But I want to hop back a little bit and talk about the power structure here, because again, when Rome falls, the empire as we know it is doomed. Like, the emperors are killed, the secular control of the empire is controlled by the Goths. But as I said, those Germanic Gothic tribes, they've been converted to Christianity already. So they keep the church. And over the next several hundred years, there are going to be lots and lots of kings or self-declared emperors, or even the Eastern Roman Empire will successfully conquer Rome at one point in the 6th century, but none of it is going to stick. And the power is essentially going to change hands so quickly that nobody is going to recognize it as a terribly authoritative. But what does stay consistent is the Bishop of Rome, the church leader who manages the Roman Church. And consequently, the bishop, who eventually starts calling himself the Pope, becomes the primary authority in Western Europe. And this is going to be the way it goes for like 1,000 years and change. Whereas over in the East, that authority isn't going to be recognized. In the Eastern Church, the general consensus is that there are 5 major churches: Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria. And those 5 churches decide what theology is. And therefore, if there's a big question like, should we see Christ as fully divine, all of these heads of all of these churches are going to put their heads together, and they're going to make a decision, and they're going to vote on it, and whoever has the highest number of votes, that's the decision that's going to be made. So if, Antioch and Jerusalem and Rome all agree that Christ is divine, but Constantinople and Alexandria disagree, doesn't matter, they get outvoted, Christ is divine. Now, the trick is, if you happen to be in the Church of Rome, operating under this system where you get one vote, and these guys who are all hanging out together and all spending a lot of time together after the Gothic tribes take over the place, all agree to some philosophical principle that you disagree with, you're going to get a little sore about it. So at least part of the reason why this great schism happens is because eventually Rome comes over and they're like, hey, we changed one of the creeds. And the Eastern Roman Empire is like, dude, you can't change the creeds. Like, you got to consult with the other churches. You didn't talk to Constantinople. You didn't talk to Antioch. You didn't talk to Alexandria. What gives you the right to, change things that are foundational principles of Christian faith just because you want to? And the answer that Rome gives is because we got the Pope. And according to Roman tradition, the Pope gets his authority from St. Peter himself, like the head disciple of Jesus. Like, there's this really important passage in the Bible where Jesus says to Peter, you are the rock on which I will build my church, and I will give you the keys, and whatever you bind on earth, I will bind in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth, I will loose in heaven. And the Romans, again, reading Latin and following Latin philosophy and conducting their own theology, come to the conclusion that, hey, since, Christ gave Peter the authority to rule, and Peter turned out to be the Bishop of Rome, then whoever Peter gave authority to as the Bishop of Rome is the guy in charge of the whole church. That makes sense, right? And the Eastern Church is like, no, it doesn't. That's nonsense. You're just making nonsense up. Which is why we end up with these two distinct churches. The Eastern Church follows the same Greek traditions that we've seen become dominant for quite a while now. Thanks to scholars like Clement of Alexandria or Origen, Greek-speaking theologians who become very influential in the Eastern Church, the Orthodox Church begins to follow its own practices and starts to take less and less interest in whatever those obnoxious people in Rome tend to think, because they are separated from a power perspective as well as from a distance perspective. Now, the Orthodox tradition is a rich one in its own right. Since the primary church in Orthodoxy is in Constantinople, they build this giant church there, the Hagia Sophia, which remains one of the most impressive churches and one of the largest churches ever built, although right now it's been turned into a mosque because it's currently controlled by the, Muslim church in, Turkey, and again, we'll get there historically, but it's going to take us a little while. What makes the Orthodox Church complicated, though, is as much as it does have its sort of own distinct identity, because of historical circumstances that we're going to talk about next time, it also gets cut into pieces pretty early. The Orthodox Church gets separated into lots of individual little churches, so chances are you haven't heard about, the capital O Orthodox Church, because that's kind of not a thing anymore. If anything, that's the Greek Orthodox Church. But you will also hear about the Armenian Orthodox Church, or the Russian Orthodox Church, or the Syrian Orthodox Church, or the Coptic Church, all of whom are essentially coming from this one tradition. They follow the same councils that were, enacted in the 5th and 6th centuries, but at one point or another, they were conquered by outside forces, were separated from the church in Constantinople, and were forced to build their own traditions and their own church in some respect. So you get a lot of different orthodoxies instead of one central orthodoxy church with one central role in leadership. By contrast, the Catholic Church remains unchallenged. This is complicated and messy in its own right, but since, you've got major theologians like Tertullian and Augustine, who we'll be reading for our next reading, all sort of writing in Latin and contributing to this greater Latin tradition, and because the Church in Rome remains the only authority that needs to be consulted, the Church in Rome declares itself the center of Christendom, period. Or at least the center of Western Christendom, for sure. The Pope is now declared the leader of the whole church, and this becomes the Roman Catholic Church, centered in Rome. Eventually they'll build their own temples, their own major churches, and this is what it looks like today. Catholicism, for the most part, remains largely unchanged from, let's call it, the 6th to 8th centuries AD. I hesitate to say that they are absolutely right in saying that Peter is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. I do think that that involves a little bit of an interpretive jump from a historical perspective. But it doesn't change the fact that that lineage, that assumption of tradition, is consistent for many, many years in a way that the Orthodox Church and definitely the Protestant Church simply do not have. So when we talk about the Church and Christendom in Western Europe, we are usually going to be referring to Catholicism, until the Protestant Reformation happens and things will get complicated. But I should stress that both churches are relevant to our study, and both churches are going to have different perspectives on the way that love and friendship actually work. So as we venture beyond the ancient world, because we generally understand that the ancient world is done now that Rome has fallen, we are now moving on into the medieval world. And with Augustine as our sort of transitional scholar, we are gradually going to focus on the way that the medieval world understands love and friendship. By which I mean we're going to talk about the way that the Roman Catholics understand love and friendship. We're going to talk about the way that the Orthodox Church understands love and friendship according to the Byzantine Empire, which will reign for quite a while. And importantly, we're also going to talk about the way Islam understands love and friendship, because they're the newcomers onto the medieval scene, and they are going to have a lot to teach us and a lot of new ideas to bring into the discussion. All of which I look forward to talking about with you soon.